Okay, so I think that's okay. I'm going to adjust the angle. That's worse. It's not going to work. Just have to go like that. All right. Okay. Hi, guys. Good to see y'all. Thanks for being here. So this is week 2 of our study on church and state. And we are going to start out the night. Shannon is going to read us a psalm. Would you mind actually coming all the way up here to read it? Is that okay? And then that way the microphone will pick you up better because you are live on the internet being broadcast across the world. No, that's fine. Come on up. But if you stand up here, then they can hear you. Otherwise, they probably won't be able to hear. You stand right there, you'll be totally fine. Okay, so she's going to read a psalm, and then I'm going to read a prayer. And this is the way that we kind of start our Wednesday nights, and then we'll get to it. So, please.
Psalm 91. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only observe with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked. If you make the Most High your dwelling, even the Lord, who is my refuge, then no harm will befall you. No disaster will come near your tent. For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread upon the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent. Because He loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read a prayer. This prayer is called Thanking God. Heavenly Father, I want to express my thankfulness to you for life, for breath, for good friends, for my family, for my job, for my home. I acknowledge that all these gifts are from your hand. Forgive me that I take them for granted so much. You are so good. I thank you most of all for Jesus Christ, my Savior and Lord. I thank you for his closeness, for his love, for his standing by me through the good times, the bad times, and just the ordinary times, and even when I fail. I thank you that you didn't give up on me. I thank you that Christ died on the cross for me, to take away my sin, to bring me back home to yourself, to put me in a right relationship with you so that I could come to know you as one of your children. I thank you for the Bible, your written word, that it points so clearly to Christ. I thank you for this deep sense of assurance you give me that I know Jesus Christ personally. Lord, I do appreciate all that you are and have done. I pray that my whole life will be an expression of gratitude to you through Jesus Christ, I pray. Amen. 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 It's always good to thank God, and I think that's a great thing to do. So I'm gonna go. I guess we're distance. Is that all right? I'm gonna take off my mask here. So this is week 2. I should have had this written up already. Week 2, Church and State, and today we are covering the Constitution. So if you remember, the purpose of this. Oh yeah, please, yeah. Can you hand those out? Thank you, Debbie. And then also here's some pins. Here's some pins for people. So if you remember from last week, the purpose of this 6-week small group Bible study thing is to learn more about how our faith interacts with the nation that we live in, how our nation that interacts with our faith. And really, it's because a lot of people during this time are experiencing high levels of anxiety, and I want to help you alleviate that anxiety. So today will hopefully be very helpful for you because we're going to talk about the Constitution, and a big part of the Constitution discusses sort of your own personal and our corporate rights within this country, and hopefully getting a better sense of those things will give us also a greater degree of comfort, because I mean the reality is I'm certainly not one to say that I always agree with what the United States does. There's right behind you there, but the reality is that of all the nations that have ever existed, the United States is one of the best for giving people some of the fundamental rights that we really enjoy. So we're going to be talking about that today, and let's dive into it. So if you have a handout, if you don't have a handout, is there an extra one?
Yes, I have.
Can I have an extra one? Thank you. In our handout, we have 2 objectives for today. I'm going to stand back here so that way they can see my full head. Thank you. So you can look right there. And if you are watching later, you can screenshot. Bam. Screenshot that, baby. If you're watching right now, then it's too late. You should have been here. 2 objectives that we have for this week. Number 1, we want to understand the basic structure of the U.S. government. And number 2, we want to explore what I'm calling civic rights alongside our Christian faith or our Christian rights. Civic rights is my fancy term that I'm using for the rights that are described in the Constitution. Okay. And those things we're going to discuss at the end. So be paying attention also now, but we're going to discuss later. The question will be, do these rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, are they in line with, are they against, or do they run parallel to our Christian faith? Are they in line with it? Do they actually run against it, or do they run parallel? And I'll explain what that means when we get to it. But that's going to be sort of what I want our takeaway today to be. So let's just dive right in. Just like last week, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking at you, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So if you have questions while I'm going along, make sure to write those things down. And when we go to questions, or you can even type them into your chat bar online. When we go to questions, I'll try to answer all of them that I can. So to start off, the U.S. Constitution is very different from the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, if you remember from last week, was a document that basically said, hey, we are no longer a part of Great Britain, and this is why. The Constitution is actually setting out the structure of our government. So if you wanted to know why the U.S. government works the way it does, all you have to do is read the Constitution. And what the Constitution establishes in our American experiment, remember I used that term last week too, in the American experiment, what the Constitution establishes is called a democratic republic. We don't really have a lot of examples of a democratic republic in history. So hopefully that'll be somewhat more readable online. And this is one of the things that makes the United States structure of our government pretty unique. The way that it works is basically we have votes. We have a democratic process of voting, but we don't really vote for all the issues. Some issues and some laws we do vote for, but mainly very specific things. In reality, we vote to elect representatives. So this is the republic part. We vote to elect representatives who then vote on our behalf. So laws that are passed by Congress are not usually passed by a popular vote with the rest of the nation. It's passed by whoever happens to be in Congress at the time. Okay. So we have a democratic republic. It's very different from a democracy and very different from a republic. It's a democratic republic. And the system that we have set up that you can read in the Constitution, I'm not going to read the whole thing, by the way. I do have a copy, but I'm just going to be reading portions of it because it's kind of long. The system is set up around this idea of checks and balances. checks and balances is a major piece of influence from, you guessed it, John Locke. If you remember, I talked about John Locke last week, and his influence on the U.S. Constitution primarily rests in this idea of checks and balances. And basically what that means is that we have three different parts of government, and each part of government can influence the other two parts in order to keep everybody in line. So number one on your cheat sheet there, the Constitution establishes the legislative branch of government. Legislative. And this is also called Congress. And Congress is made up of two houses. What are they called? Who's got it? The what? House of Representatives and the Senate. Yes, so the House of Representatives and the Senate make up Congress, and Congress is the legislative branch of the government. They're responsible for passing laws, raising taxes, confirming posts. They're responsible for impeachment. Only Congress, and this is going to be key when we talk about our civic rights, only Congress has the ability to amend the Constitution. So nobody can change anything about the Constitution except Congress. Congress is the only thing that can change any aspect of the Constitution. That's very important. Okay, number two, our second branch of government is the executive branch. So, and I should say the legislative branch is discussed in Article 1 of the Constitution. The executive branch is discussed in Article 2 of the Constitution. If you are keeping score at home and you want to go read about it, go for it. This is Article 2. And the executive branch is made up primarily of the president. The president makes up the executive branch, and everybody who assists the president, the vice president, the cabinet, most departments, the Department of Homeland Security, the Pentagon, Department of National Security, all those departments reside under the executive branch of government. Okay, they're responsible for executive orders, nominating posts. The president is called the commander-in-chief, meaning that in times of war, the president is the one who is responsible for military action, even though, of course, a lot of generals are involved in advising that sort of a thing. But technically, the president is the commander-in-chief of all of our armed forces. So that's the executive branch. And number three, the third branch is the judicial branch. And this is made up of all the federal courts and also culminating in the Supreme Court. Okay. And I realize that for some people, this is all very elementary, but sorry, my handwriting from that to Judicial. My apologies. Never had very good handwriting. Always been ashamed of my handwriting. Secret shame.
Nobody knows handwriting.
I know, right? And me included. And the judicial branch is responsible for determining the constitutionality of laws and interpreting the Constitution. And we're going to talk about them and their role in our civic rights in a little bit. So John Locke first proposed this idea of having a system of checks and balances wherein none of these branches of government has the ability to have complete control over society. And so here's the way that it sort of works, okay? The Congress can pass laws. That's their main thing that they get to contribute. But the president has to sign those laws to make them legal. And if the president chooses, they could veto a bill, meaning they refuse to sign it and it doesn't become a law. So Congress might be able to pass laws, but the president can say, no, that law should not be a law. And that one person gets to decide it's not a law, okay? Additionally, Congress can pass laws, but it's up to the courts to decide whether those laws violate the Constitution. So if Congress passes a law that is unconstitutional, the courts can strike that law down and say, no, that law no longer exists because it violates the Constitution, which has happened several times. All these things have happened many, many times in U.S. history. So that's the way that this branch of government is sort of controlled. The president signs laws and the courts can throw laws out. All right, next, moving on, the president. So the main contributions the president gets to have, the main powers that affect our lives are two main things. Number one, executive orders. So a president can issue a bunch of executive orders, which is what our current president is doing, and kind of work around Congress and in a sense the courts. Here's the thing: all executive orders are subject to the same constitutional bar that regular laws are. So judicial courts can determine whether executive orders are unconstitutional or not. And if you remember, do you remember the very early on in Donald Trump's presidency, he passed an executive order banning immigration from certain countries. Do you remember this? And people were very up in arms because they felt like he was targeting Muslim-dominated countries. And so it ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided it was not in violation of the Constitution for the government to do that, for the president to do that. So it can go either way. Sometimes it ends up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, that's not unconstitutional. Sometimes the Supreme Court says, yes, that is unconstitutional. But the Supreme Court can limit the executive powers of a president. And then Congress, of course, has the ability to impeach and convict or remove a president from office. So Congress is, which again happened recently, but Congress has the ability to do that. So that's the way that this branch is controlled. The courts can tell them that what they're doing is unconstitutional, and Congress can impeach and convict a president. Okay? So now we move on to the judicial court. The judicial branch is mainly responsible for interpreting the Constitution, deciding what is constitutional and what is not. That's a pretty big power. Here's how the other branches can limit that power. First off, let me get to my thing here. So the president gets to appoint all federal judges. They get to nominate all federal judges, I should say. So, for example, when there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court, the president is the one who says, I want this post to be filled by this person. And they get to handpick that person. So you can look at a judge's history of how they decide in cases, and the president gets to decide who is going to be in line to take that position on the Supreme Court. Okay. But not just the Supreme Court. Every federal judge in the nation is handpicked by the president. So if you had a president in power for 8 years, what that means is every single time a federal judge retired or passed away or stepped down or resigned from their post, the president gets to choose who replaces that judge at every federal level, from the Supreme Court down to the local federal courts in Salem. Okay, so that's a way that the executive power governs this power. The problem with that, which is really, I mean, you might think, wow, that's a lot of power. Here's the problem: is that sometimes judges are appointed thinking, oh, this person's going to decide in this manner, and then they don't do that. So famously, Dwight D. Eisenhower, at the end of his presidency, he had the chance to nominate 2 Supreme Court justices, and he was a Republican and conservative. So he picked 2 conservative judges to be on the Supreme Court. Well, once they got on the court, both judges started siding primarily with the liberal side of the court. And so at the end of his presidency, a press asked Eisenhower, did you ever make any mistakes? And he said, I made 2 mistakes, and they're both sitting on the Supreme Court. So, just because the president nominates certain people to be in those posts, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to align with what the president had intended to do. So it is power over those courts, but it's not full power. Congress, meanwhile, can also impeach, convict, and remove judges. So Congress can decide if a judge has acted out of malice or anything like that, and they can actually impeach and remove federal judges and Supreme Court justices. It's pretty rare to have that happen, but they can do that.
How many legislators in Congress how many people have to be on board to have that happen?
So good. So the way that it works is this: there's a 2-part impeachment process for federal judges or for the president. The first part is controlled by the House of Representatives. It's the responsibility of the House to decide whether somebody should be they should try to impeach somebody or not. So, for example, in the last impeachment, I'm just going to use this because it's happening right now, so it's easy to use. So when the House decided that they wanted to impeach Donald Trump because of what happened earlier in this month, all they needed was a simple majority of votes to impeach him. They already had that majority. There was 10 Republican legislators who joined the Democrats, but they didn't even need those 10. All they needed was a simple majority. And once that impeachment vote has been had and they reach the threshold, the president is impeached from that moment on. He's impeached. Then the trial now we move to the Senate. Yeah. So then they take that football, basically that bill, and they say, we've impeached the president. And then they go to the Senate and they say, now it's your job, basically. And the Senate becomes the jury for the trial of the president. And in order for a president to actually be convicted and removed from office, you need to have 2/3 of the Senate voting to convict. So you can't just it's not a simple majority. You have to have 2/3. That's 67 senators, 67 out of 100 senators have to vote to convict. It hasn't ever happened in U.S. history. Several presidents have been impeached, but none of them have ever been convicted by the Senate, because it's very difficult to reach that 2/3 threshold, because you only, that's a big gap to overcome, which we'll talk about later too. Good question. But if the president was convicted by the Senate, he would then she would be removed from office. The vice president would become president, and on down the line. Okay, so just last week, do you remember we talked a little bit about individual liberty versus the union? And what I said was that there's tension between those two ideas. And because of the tension between individual liberties and this sort of federal system, the system remains somewhat static. But like I said, if you had a tug of war and you put 5 huge guys on one side and 5 equally huge guys on the other side, and they started pulling at the same time, the rope would remain where it was. So it becomes static. It doesn't move because of the tension in both directions. It's the same kind of thing with checks and balances. All 3 of these branches are pulling on each other at the same time. And the idea is to give each branch enough power to pull as hard as they can, and they won't hopefully be able to overpower another branch, but they'll be able to keep everything in tension so that it stays relatively static. That's part of what makes up the American experiment. That is a very unstable way to do government, because you can imagine if it was ever possible for a president or a Congress or a Supreme Court to chip away at the powers of one of the other 2 branches, hypothetically, to add a few more people to their side of the triangle, then they could pull the whole thing over and the whole experiment collapses, right? So that's why it's important to have these tensions in place. It is a bit unstable, but it's worked for a while. Fingers crossed. God willing, and the creek won't rise. So, yes. So what the last thing I wanted to say about this was that what that means is, even when one party controls all 3 branches, when one political party controls all 3 branches, it's incredibly difficult to force the sort of fundamental changes that you might expect a party to want to do. There's been 6 times in the modern era, that is 6 times since 1927, when one party has controlled all 3 branches of government. They've controlled the Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. 6 times since the 20s, right? Yeah, 6 times since the 20s. 4 times controlled by the Republicans, twice controlled by the Democrats. And if you look at, when we get to the amendments of the Constitution, actually changing the Constitution, if you look at those changes, it does not at all fall along the lines of when when the parties controlled all the House. You would think that if the Republicans controlled all three branches, they would get a ton done and they would be able to make some kind of radical changes to really advance their policies. That is actually just not the case. And the same thing with the Democrats. When they've been in power in all three of these branches, the way that our system is set up, the tension between these branches is so extreme that even when you control all three of them, it's very difficult to push through the sort of really radical changes that you might expect people to want to do. The most recent time that one party has controlled each of these three branches, do you remember when it was? Anybody? 2016 to 2018. The first 2 years of Donald Trump's presidency, Republicans controlled all three branches of the US government. And they didn't get a ton done. In fact, the government shut down during that time period. So I'm not too concerned when one party controls all three things, right? And that should be, if you're a Democrat and you're like, I'm freaking out because Republicans are in control of everything, calm down. It'll be okay. They can't do much. And if you're a Republican, you're like, I'm freaking out because the Democrats are in control of everything, calm down. It's okay. They can't do much. So just let yourself, slide into it. 6 times that's happened in the last 120 years, and it has never produced the sort of radical changes that we're afraid of. Okay, moving on. Next, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the Constitution, and specifically we're going to look at some different ways to interpret the Constitution. Because everybody agrees, all of these branches agree that this is the document that is going to provide the fundamental nature of our nation. Everybody agrees on that. Nobody disagrees. Everybody agrees on that. The difference is how you interpret this document. Just like in Scripture, right? You could have 5 people looking at the same Scripture. They each see something different. Same thing with the Constitution. So I'm going to present to you 3 different... No, I'm not. I'm not going to do that next. You guys need to be yelling at me. Amendments is what we're talking about next. Sorry. You got to yell louder. Amendments is what we're doing next. And then we're going to look at 3 different ways to interpret the Constitution. So let's look at amendments. Amendments are basically, so if you read the Constitution, if you wanted to read it, I took the time to read it a couple times in preparation for tonight. Article 1 deals with the legislature. Article 2 deals with the executive office. Article 3 deals with the judicial system. Article 4 deals with states' rights. Articles 5 through 7 are not very interesting. It's stuff like these are the signers of this Constitution. We think that this Constitution should go into effect on this day, that kind of thing. And then after that, you get a whole list of amendments. We have 27 amendments. And these are times in history when the Constitution has actually been changed. They're fairly rare in history. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. You may know about them. They were established in 1791. So very, very soon after. This was 1781, 1791. The Bill of Rights was ratified. And since that time, in 1791, only 17 changes have been made to the Constitution. And 2 of those changes canceled each other out. So really only 15 changes have occurred to our Constitution since 1791. Yeah. Only 15 changes. What's that?
It sounds like a lot, but when you think about the amount of time.
Yes, when you're thinking about 230 years, 15 changes isn't a lot. The reason why they're so rare is because they're very, very difficult to do. Changes to the Constitution are very, very hard to do. First, you have to pass the normal process of a law. It has to pass both the House and the Senate, so it passes through Congress, and it has to be signed by the president. Then an amendment has to be ratified, and that means that 3/4 of all the states in the Union say, we want this to be a change to the Constitution. So for us, that would be, well, we'll do the math, 38 states. 38 states have to say, we want this Constitution to happen. It's uncommon now, it's always been uncommon that many states would agree on anything. So they're very rare. Additionally, most amendments, in fact, most amendments, especially in the modern era, come with an expiration date on it. And the expiration date is a part of the amendment, and it basically says, if this amendment is not ratified within 7 years, it dies. So even if it passes Congress and is signed by the president, even if there would be a time when it would be ratified, if it isn't done within 7 years, it dies. So it's very, very difficult to get amendments passed and ratified. And for this reason, there has not been very many. Okay, that's going to be really important when we talk about civic rights, because it means that they're very, they're not going to change anytime soon. We'll just say that. Okay. So right now I'm going to talk about three basic kinds of amendments, three kinds of the changes to the Constitution that have been made. The first one, and I'm going to end with the most interesting one. So the first one's the most boring one. These are structural changes, and I have a list on there of the amendments that this covers: the 12th, the 16th, 17th, 20th, 22nd, 25th, 27th. These amendments basically slightly alter the structure of our government, and they're usually in response to unforeseeable circumstances. For example, 1960, what was that? When was JFK assassinated? Remember 1967? Was it? 63. 1963, JFK is assassinated, right? And all of a sudden, there's a huge problem with the Constitution. And that is that modern medicine is advancing to the place that if JFK had been hit in a slightly different way, he may not have been assassinated, but he may have been brain dead. So he might have still been alive. And as long as he was alive, technically he would have been our president. And because he had not committed what's called a treasonous act or high crime or misdemeanor, which are the only things that Congress can impeach a president for, Congress wouldn't be able to remove him from office. So we would have a president on life support in the hospital who couldn't do anything, but we couldn't do anything about it. And he would be our president until his term was up or he died in the hospital. That's a real problem. There's no mechanism in the Constitution that says if the guy's sick, you can just ignore him. So the 25th Amendment was passed in 1967, passed and ratified in 1967. And basically the 25th Amendment says, if the president is completely incapacitated, the vice president can basically make it known with a majority vote of the cabinet. So within the executive office, the vice president and a majority of the cabinet members decide that the president's no longer able to fulfill his duties as president. They can present that to Congress, and the vice president can become the president. The president, on the other hand, if he thinks that or she thinks that the vice president acted unduly, can fight that and become president again very, very easily. But this was set up so that in the unlikely scenario that we had a president who was incapacitated somehow, Reagan almost came under the 25th Amendment because they were concerned about Alzheimer's. As you remember, Donald Trump, I don't think that there was any hope that would have come, but it's a thing. But it was really set up because of JFK. Because if we had a president who had been shot or some kind of disease or something, and he was or she was incapacitated and unable to be president anymore, we need a mechanism to remove that person from office so that we can continue running the country. Okay, so that's when I say structural changes to the Constitution, that's what we're talking about, stuff like that. Some of it's interesting. Next, the second change that's been made to the Constitution is concerning voting rights. The 14th, 15th, 19th, 23rd, and 24th Amendment all deal with voting rights. Who gets to vote has been an evolving discussion within our nation for a long time. I just realized that clock is terribly slow, so I should probably pick up the pace a little bit. Originally, only white landowners could vote, and we have lowered that bar significantly. So nowadays, all these amendments basically come up to saying every citizen, regardless of their gender or their ethnicity or their socioeconomic status, over the age of 18 are allowed to vote except for some ex-convicts. That's basically where our voting threshold is right now. And there's some interesting things about why and when those things changed, but we're not going to get into it. So that's the second basic change that's happened in the Constitution. The third basic change that has happened to the Constitution is regarding our civic rights. And this is where I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about it. The civic rights of our Constitution are basically rights for U.S. citizens that apply to every U.S. citizen. So, for example, when you may feel anxiety about, well, what if the government tries to do this or tries to stop this from happening? I'm going to read you your civic rights, and until an amendment to the Constitution is passed, signed, and ratified by 37 states, these rights cannot change.
How many amendments deal with this?
So the first through 9 amendments, so you got 9 right there, then the 11th and the 13th, so you got 11, and I'm actually going to read, there's one right that I found that's not in the amendments, that's actually included in the Constitution itself. So I'm going to read that one too. So I would say there's 12. 12 rights. Okay. So I'm going to read the first one to you. This is in Article 1, Section 9. Deals with the legislature. This is what it says. It says, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Now, what on earth does that mean? A writ of habeas corpus literally in Latin means, where's the body? Where's the body? Habeas corpus, where's the body? And what this basically means is, like in the 80s and 90s even, in certain countries in Latin America where you had like a dictator, the way that they would deal with dissenters is they would disappear. You hear about this? Mm-hmm. And the government would sort of somebody would go to work and then they just wouldn't come home. And who knows where they went. And that was the end of that. In the US, you can't do that. We have what's called a writ of habeas corpus, which means where's the body, which means that any lawyer or family member, or a lawyer representing a family member can go to the police station and say, I demand to see so-and-so, and they have to produce that person. If they don't produce that person, they have violated your constitutional rights, and they can be sued for millions of dollars, and they can be really terrible things can happen to them. So in our Constitution, you have to produce. Now, the only exceptions are in cases of rebellion, and it has been used in cases of rebellion. Abraham Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus during the Civil War and put people away in clandestine prisons, which, Abe Lincoln, good old honest Abe. Yes, he did hide people away in prison that he did not want out and about because he felt like these people were influencers and they could possibly swing some of the northern states to the southern cause. And he didn't want that to happen, so he kind of shut them away. Except for in cases of rebellion, you can't do that. So if somebody that you know got arrested and you wanted to go see them, you go to the police station and say, I want to see this person. They have to let you do it. Right. Now they can have, like, jails have like visiting hours, but they have to allow you to see the person. Okay. So that's the first one. All right. So now let's go to the amendments, and I'm just going to read quickly the rest of your rights as U.S. citizens. I'm going to try to do as quick as I can, and I might skip little pieces that are not as important to the guts of it. So this is amendments 1 through 9. I'm just going to hold my fingers for when I'm reading them. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free expression thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. They can't stop you from saying anything or not saying anything, and they can't force you to choose a religion or to practice a particular religion or do anything to stop you from practicing a religion. Number 2, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We'll return to this again when we talk about interpretation. It'll be interesting. Number 3, no soldier shall in times of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Do you remember last week in the Declaration of Independence how important it was that they brought up that soldiers were being quartered in people's homes? You remember that?
Yeah.
So it's actually a right that the Army cannot come to your house and say, you have to put these 5 soldiers up.
Right.
They could ask you, and you could decline if you wanted to. But why wouldn't you want to have 5 soldiers on? Maybe you wouldn't. Number 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, on and on and on. In other words, and this is really actually a useful thing. If the police come to your house and they want to search your house, if they don't have a warrant, legally they cannot enter your house. Now, they can say, can we come inside and look around a little bit? And if you say, sure, come on in, now you have given them the right to interest. But if they come to your house and say, I would like to come in and look around, and you say, do you have a warrant? And they say no. According to your constitutional rights, they cannot step into your threshold. And if they do, put it like this, they have done that in the past, and it always results, if you're ever guilty of anything, it results in a mistrial because they're violating your constitutional rights to do that. So if they find anything, they find a gun and a body and a note that says, I just murdered this person, but they didn't have a warrant to search your house, you are free to go and you will never be charged with that crime. So just as FYI, which is why it's very important also for police officers. They know that, so they won't violate it unless they're not very smart. Number 5, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. You have to have a grand jury for big crimes, which means you can't have secret trials. They can't just bundle you away into a room with a judge and accuse you of committing murder, and then you get convicted, and that's the end of it. You have to be tried in front of a jury. On and on. And you cannot be charged twice. That's called double jeopardy for the same crime. And you cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The government cannot just come and take your stuff, right? They have to go through the legal process. And again, have violations of this occurred in the past? Yes, they have. And when they do, usually they result in very terrible things happening to the people who are doing them. These are your constitutional rights. They cannot be violated. Let's move on. 6, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime has been committed. In other words, you can't just be sitting in prison for years and years and years without a trial. That's actually come up because sometimes our court cases get backlogged, and then they have to actually let people go because it's your right to have a speedy and fair trial. Number 7, this is an interesting one, which doesn't apply very much to us, but where the value in controversy shall exceed $20 in issues of common law, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved. In other words, if you get accused of like money laundering of an amount over $20, you can have the right to a jury. If it's $10, apparently not. Not sure who is out there laundering like $19.99 in the hopes that they won't have to. Okay, number 8, excessive bail shall not be required, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Classic. Which is why we had to get rid of a lot of things like hangings. Once it was proved that was a cruel way to kill somebody, you couldn't do it anymore. It's against their constitutional rights. And number 9, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, which means that if there are other rights that you have naturally as a human being, but they're not contained in the Constitution, that doesn't mean that you don't have those rights. It just means that this is not an all-inclusive list. Your total rights are not included in this. That's what that right says. All right, really quickly, I'm going to read 11 and 13, and then we're going to talk about interpretation because that's important, and then hopefully we'll have enough time for discussion. So number 11, this amendment was passed in 1795. And basically what it says is that, like, you know how states have different laws, right? And Oregon has different laws than Washington. Like smoking pot became legal in Oregon before, I don't even know if it's legal in Idaho, I don't think. If you smoke pot in the state of Oregon, police from Idaho can't come to your house and arrest you for violating Idaho law and take you to jail. That's what the 11th Amendment says. Each state can't go after members of another state for violating the laws of their own state. Does that make sense? All right. And then the 13th Amendment is, you can't own slaves. That's a big thing. You can't own slaves and you can't be a slave in the United States. Really interesting caveat. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for a crime, wherever the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. So convicts can and do and are employed in
Community service.
in acts of service and in work that they are not compensated for.
Right.
They do have a system of compensation in most places, but if you have been convicted of a crime, you can be forced into servitude and not be compensated for it.
Right.
But if you aren't, you can't be. Okay, they can't just make you a slave. Okay, those are your civic rights. Those are control civic rights. All right, those are your rights as a U.S. citizen. And like I said, it's basically, I'm not going to say it's impossible for those rights to be taken away, but what I am going to say is that it would require so much effort. For example, to take away your freedom of religion, they would have to propose an amendment, it would have to pass the House and Senate, be signed by a president, and then 37 states would have to ratify that to take out that particular, 37 out of the 50 states have to ratify that to take it out of the Constitution, which is probably not going to happen. And some people feel like, and I feel like a lot of fear in this moment as well, okay, but the government can just, what if you have unscrupulous people in government and they just violate your rights and they don't care, right? Because they're bad guys. Here's the thing about that. Every federal employee, from the president to our local post office employees, and every person in the military, and we have a standing military of 1.4 million people and a reserve force of about 850,000. Every single federal employee or person who works for the government has to take an oath at the beginning of their time, which says, I will support and defend the U.S. Constitution against all threats, domestic and foreign. So what that means is that the entire system is sort of set up to not violate these rights. And is it possible that somebody in a position of power doesn't care about that oath and violates anyways? Yes, that is possible, and things like that do happen. But if you think and I wish we had Angie here, but we have some ex-military. Dave was ex-military. Who else ex-military? Any ex-military? So Dave is a good guy. How many people do you think you knew? I mean, this is kind of give me a ballpark. How many people do you think you interacted with on a somewhat more than casual basis in your time in the military? How many people? Yeah, I mean, is it close to 100? Is it close to 1,000? How many military personnel, officers and,
Probably 100.
Probably 100 people?
100.
Yeah, okay, good. And how many of those people do you think, because I'm assuming you had to also take this oath to, yes.
I remember well.
How many of those 100 people that you know decently well, do you think if somebody actually came down to it and wanted to force them to violate that oath, how many of those 100 people do you think would actually do it? Would actually go against that oath and violate the Constitution or not uphold that oath?
That's a good question.
Could you think of anybody that would definitely jump at the chance to violate that oath of your time in the military?
A lot of the guys I knew were smoking dope and
Sure.
having a good time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's a good question. It was even in their mind.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, the probability that enough service people would be willing to rise up and work against the Constitution, would you say that's
Very unlikely.
very unlikely? I would agree with that. I think that regardless of what your personal understanding of the military is, one of the things that I really appreciate the military is it's very duty bound, very a high sense of honor, a high sense of duty. And I think that the likelihood of the U.S. government being able to use the military to violate your constitutional rights would be very, very, very difficult to do. Yes.
In fact, we had some local sheriffs
Mm-hmm.
that came out and put it on Facebook and said that we do not feel that, we're not gonna be out looking at how many cars you have in your house to arrest these people.
They felt like that was infringing upon.
On their constitution. I don't
Right.
think anybody remember that.
So probably we could say people are probably going to err more on the side of, I don't want to at all violate the Constitution, as opposed to this idea that there are nefarious forces in government who, at the drop of a hat, are going to come and seize your house and your property and your children and violate your constitutional rights. Probably less likely that that's going to happen. Yes, Ms. Linda.
I'm confused.
Go ahead.
Are you saying that every government employee has to say to?
Every single government employee, the post office workers down the street have to say this oath as well.
Well, but I
Federal
work for the
employee.
Federal government, I don't remember, but now I'm old too, so.
What did you do for the federal government?
I worked for a lot of things.
Sure.
Actually, I even worked for the, craft system.
It's possible that you were a contractor
Right.
and maybe not a direct employee.
And they do that. I worked for the state,
Yeah.
you know, and for the,
Yes.
for the post office, but there was like a contract.
Yeah.
So we were in college.
Yeah.
So we didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
though
That's
we worked
possible.
for the post office,
Yeah.
worked for the federal government, they didn't make us say that because they contracted us kind of.
Right. So,
Do you think- I'm
yeah.
sorry,
No, go ahead.
Do you think maybe they could have asked me to do that on the first one and then I didn't have to ever do it again? Because I've worked for several government employees.
yeah, that's possible.
That's probably what I did then.
So I want to sort of put to bed, hopefully, a little bit of the anxiety around, I'm worried that the federal government's going to come and violate my constitutional rights. The likelihood of that happening is going to be very, very, very slim. They would have to go through a lot of effort first. There's a lot of things stopping that from happening. It's not just like the president or somebody in Congress can make a telephone call and the military will go take the people that live in your house away from you. That's, I'm not going to say it's impossible because I don't think anything's really impossible, but the likelihood of that happening is so incredible. Now, there's a lot of countries in the world that happens on a regular basis. But the United States, the likelihood of that happening here is very, 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 very infinitesimally small.
What was it you just said?
The government's not going to come and violate your rights, your constitutional rights. But now here's the caveat, and we're going to quickly spend, because that clock really messed me up. We're going to quickly spend some time talking about interpretation. Oh, good Lord, I got 10 minutes. Everybody agrees the Constitution. Everybody agrees on the rights that we have, okay? Everybody's on board with that.
Yeah.
But how you interpret the Constitution is going to be different. So really quickly, I'm going to talk about 3 different interpretive ways to look at the Constitution. The first is called textualists. I'll write this on here. Textualists. And I have there on the handout the names of members of our Supreme Court who generally fall into these interpretive categories. So a textualist is somebody who interprets the Constitution very, very literally. They stick to the text of the Constitution. It says what it says. Then we have pragmatists. Pragmatists also stick to the Constitution, but they say it's not just important to look at the Constitution. We also have to look at precedent that has come down since the Constitution. So we should look at like the history of law within the United States, not just the Constitution, but also how that Constitution has been interpreted through time, and that can help us get a more clear idea of what's right or wrong. Then we have living constitutionalists. Living constitutionalists. And as you can imagine, they think that the Constitution is a living document, which means that it's the importance of the Constitution, what the Constitution applies to, can change over time. So I'm going to really quickly discuss how one particular amendment might be interpreted 3 different ways and give you the continuum of what could happen on either sides of an extreme, we're just going to use the words left and right, political interpretation, okay? Because I think that a lot of times we get afraid of what these people might do, and I'm going to tell you what they could do, and then I'm going to tell you why I don't think that they will do that, okay? So let's look at the Second Amendment rights. Second Amendment says to furnish a well-armed militia, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. I'm butchering it. Being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, so let's say the state of Oregon passes a law that could be infringing on that right. And so there's a trial process, and it goes up through the court system, and it ends up at the Supreme Court, okay? And the Supreme Court has to decide, does this law actually infringe on these rights, or does it not infringe on those rights? And this is how the Supreme Court justices might be thinking. So we have 4 textualists on the court right now, and they would look at the Second Amendment, and they would say this. They may say this. This is all conjecture. They may say this. It says in the Constitution that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Not be infringed. Therefore, they could argue, again, they maybe won't, they maybe, but they could argue that any law which appears to infringe upon the right to keep and bear arms is in violation of your constitutional rights. They could argue that, okay? That's it from a textualist perspective. Now, a pragmatist may look at the same law and say, okay, it's important to pay attention to the text of the document. However, and in this case, if this was the case, then it could be argued that no gun control is constitutional. It could be argued that. Again, I'm not saying that is what they argue. I'm saying that could be argued. That any control that infringes on your right to bear arms is unconstitutional. A pragmatist may look at the same law and say, this is very true. However, there is precedent. And that is a lot of laws are already established around gun control, for example. And it makes a little sense to have those laws in place. If you had somebody who had a history of abuse and had just gotten done with a huge yelling match with his wife, and he has a history of mental illness and drug abuse, and he walks into a gun store to buy a handgun, should that person leave that store that day with a handgun in their hand? Most people would say probably not. Not a good idea. So we already have laws in place. For example, there's a waiting period for purchasing handguns. You have to wait like 5 or 7 days or something. 4 days. Thank you, Felix. So that if you go to the store and you're like, I'm going to kill that person, it forces you to wait 4 days, and then ideally your temperature has decreased.
I just thought it was so they could check you out in the meantime.
And they also run background checks in some cases. And there's a whole different list of things. Okay, so a pragmatist would say, well, there's precedent for some gun control measures. So some control could be constitutional, is what they would argue. That's really interesting because they're both looking at the same law. These people could say no gun control is constitutional, but these people looking at the same law could say some gun control is constitutional. Do you see how that works? Because they are taking into account precedent. Now, a living constitutionalist may look at the same law and argue that what matters is not the text, but the context of that law. So a living constitutionalist may argue that when this law was written, the most common weapons available for everyday people to use were like one-shot muskets and that kind of thing. And they may argue, if you took a musket to a crowded church, for example, and you wanted to do harm to the people in that church, how many people would you seriously be able to kill before you were overpowered? 1, maybe 2. I mean, you got to fire, and then you got to, like, you know, drop the thing, and then the black powder and stuff it in there, and then fire. I mean, there's going to be, maybe you get a second shot off, right? But after the first shot, you know. But if I wanted to purchase today a semi-automatic rifle and take that rifle into a church, how many people could I destroy if I had 3 loaded clips on me before I was able to be stopped? I could potentially destroy a lot more people today than they could destroy at their best 200 years ago. So a living constitutionalist may argue that this right applies to a specific circumstance which no longer exists anymore, and therefore much gun control could be constitutional. Now, again, I'm not saying that you have to agree with any of these 3. I'm just saying that this is what they're thinking. Notice nobody is thinking this right needs to be removed. These people are thinking we have to the text is clear. These people are thinking, well, the text is clear, but there is precedent. These people are thinking, well, what matters the most is the context of it. So what could you get? Well, if we took a traditionally political spectrum, at the most, you would still have some, maybe you could say, minimal gun control. You would still have some gun control, because even if you got somebody who said it absolutely cannot be infringed upon, okay, well, should it be possible for an average citizen to purchase a nuclear warhead? No, I don't care how much money you have. That is not a part of this right. And there's no living person who would think that that would be a good idea, right? Nobody would say, yes, the average person should own, anti-tank or, a fully equipped Black Hawk helicopter that they land in their backyard. Nobody thinks that that's a good idea. So at the very extreme end, you still have some gun control. Maybe it's very minimal, but you do have gun control. And then at this extreme end, right, where you have people who advocate for a lot of gun control, lots of gun control, the one thing that they absolutely cannot do is say that it's complete gun control, because complete gun control would be to go beyond even the context of this discussion. If you wanted to have complete gun control, you would have to amend this constitutional right, because complete gun control would mean in no circumstances could you have arms. And that would be in clear violation even from the most liberal perspective on this. So at the most extreme end of left, you have lots of gun control, but not complete. And at the most extreme end of right, you have some gun control, but not a lot. And I think what happens sometimes, to get back to this thing about fear, is that, how to say this delicately, people want to manipulate you all the time. They want to manipulate you, and they want your votes. So this is what they say. Don't vote for those Republicans. They're going to put a gun in every hand of every person. Every child is going to have a gun, and they're going to be killing people in the streets. And they're evil people because they want everybody to own, explosive weapons and bazookas and stuff. Nobody wants that. That's crazy. But they say that because they want you to vote against them. And then on the other side, they say, they're going to come and take all your guns away. They're going to come into your house while you're sleeping. They're not even going to knock. They're going to find the guns and they're going to take them and then they're going to use them on you. Nobody wants to do that. That would be such a violation of so many constitutional rights, right? So they say that because they want your vote. They want to manipulate you. it's the reality of it is somewhere in here. The reality of it is somewhere in there. Some gun control is a good thing, right? Complete gun control is unconstitutional. So this is the reality of it. Will we see gun controls tighten under President Biden? Maybe. I don't really think we saw them loosen a lot during Trump's era. Maybe they loosened a little. So could there be some stricter gun controls in the future? Possibly. The one thing I do know is it won't be complete control because that would be impossible. And usually when they do pass gun control, by the way, they grandfather things in, except for like semi-automatics and that kind of thing. But even then, they'll offer you money for it. So you'll get something. So anyways, all that to say, let's not be too afraid. There is a continuum between they're going to come take all our guns or they're going to give everybody in the world a gun. Yes,
And
Ken?
that's just not the second amendment there. That's throughout the whole Constitution. You've got these three.
Yes.
Fighting against each other.
Exactly right.
Interpretation of the Constitution.
Exactly right. And some things are more clear than others. You know, like for example, take free speech. How free should free speech be? That's a really important question, right? Like, so in 1919, there was a guy who was arrested and deported because he distributed anti-enlistment pamphlets during World War I that were aimed to kind of keep people from signing up to fight in the war. And so he was arrested and deported for that, and then fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that it was his free speech to say what he wanted to in the pamphlet. And the Supreme Court actually ruled against him, that it was not in violation of his freedom of speech. And later, there was like in the 30s, another Supreme Court decision that reversed that. But so that is a contentious issue. How free should free speech be? So we have something called the Rico Act. Do you guys know the Rico Act? Yeah, this is kind of a cool thing. This is set up to take down the mafia, because the mafia is set up in such a way that the people at the top who control everything never actually commit any crimes, technically. They tell somebody, I might tell Felix to go kill somebody, but I don't go out and do it. So I'm just exercising my free speech, and Felix is the dude actually pulling the trigger. And so the Rico Acts basically were established to say that if I know that my words will cause him to go out and kill someone, and I direct him to do that, I'm just as liable for murder as he is. So the Rico Acts basically destroyed the mafia because of that. So that again is, how free is free speech? Is it okay to tell somebody to go kill somebody knowing that they will do it? That perhaps would be in violation of that. So yes, it is. They're all in debate. But again, the issue is not, no one is ever going to say we should have complete control over free speech. And no one should ever say there should never be control over free speech. Because again, if we never had control over free speech, the mafia would be much more powerful than it is today because of these sorts of laws. So it's got to be somewhere in the middle. And the messy middle ground is going to be where we find ourselves.
So all these people yelling and screaming and saying, they're going to take our guns, they're going to take our guns.
Right.
They can't. They don't know.
No, they cannot do that. It is impossible for them to do that. It's not impossible, but for them to do that, what they would first have to do is propose an amendment. That amendment would have to pass the House and the Senate, get signed into law by the president, and then ratified by 37 states. And there's no 37 states that are going to be doing that.
So the thing they can do is add more taxes on.
They can add taxes to it. Now that they can do. That they can do. Yes. So that's called sin taxes. So this is, the government can use money as a way to discourage you from doing things it doesn't want you to do. Yeah, like smoking or purchasing guns or working or like, yeah. So lotto tickets, yeah, they can tax you to death, but they can't stop you from doing it. Okay. I think that's it. Any other last minute questions? I wish we had more time for discussion. I apologize, guys, but that clock threw me off, and now we're 5 minutes over. I was going to ask what rights you think are in line with or violate our Christian rights, but I feel like that would be opening way too big of a can of worms at this late at night.
Let's save it.
Let's save it. Yeah, Felix has a question though.
So talking about crimes, so
Yeah,
you can't get convicted for the same crime twice.
correct.
But what if there's more than one crime? That, like, if you murdered somebody and stole his car and pushed his mom, can you get stacked up on top of each other? Or
Yeah,
so
yes, so you can, for example, a great example is, what's his name? He's a mafia guy. I like my mafia guys. Shoot. Al Capone. Wow, you got it. Al Capone.
I know, you know what I do?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Al Capone. So Al Capone, a criminal mastermind involved in a lot of crimes. No crime could ever stick to him. He had great lawyers. He had politicians in his pocket. He had judges in his pocket. So what they finally got him on was money laundering. But they nailed him to the wall for money laundering. They nailed him so hard he was in prison for the rest of his life. But they never got him on any of their stuff. So yeah, so you could, if you have a mistrial on murder and you have a mistrial on rape and you have a mistrial, but they catch you on, I don't know, tax evasion, they can get you hard, and they can try. And then if they have a sympathetic judge and the judge knows that you got leniency on all the other things, maybe the judge basically gets like a recommendation. We recommend you give him somewhere between 10 and 25 years. And so maybe the judge says, I'm going to give him 25 because I know he's gotten out of so much other stuff, So, okay. I think that's it. All right. Let me pray. Lord, we thank you so much for this time. God, would you please help us, Lord, as we interpret our civic rights. And I just pray, Lord, I know that we don't have time to talk about it, so I pray that you would do it in our hearts. But remind us, Lord, that civic rights are different than Christian rights.
Yes.
And that just because we have the freedom of speech, that doesn't mean that everything that we say is, that we are free to speak like we maybe sometimes want to, because we are constrained by you, Lord. And you get to tell us what our rights are. So we are grateful to live in a country that allows us so many civic rights, but we pray that we wouldn't get confused that those are our Christian rights. So teach us, O Lord, what you desire to be good, and we pray that we follow after that. In your name, Jesus, amen. Thanks, guys. God bless.